Well, I'm Richard Heinberg, Senior Fellow with the Post-Carbon Institute. I've written several books on the subject of fossil fuel depletion. My first book on the subject was called The Party's Over: Oil, War, and the Fate of Industrial Societies. I first became concerned about fossil fuel depletion about 12 years ago when I read an article in Scientific American called The End of Cheap Oil by two petroleum geologists. I immediately understood, as I hadn't before, the central importance of energy to modern industrial societies, and particularly oil, because we're dependent on oil for about 95% of our transportation: planes, trains, automobiles, ships. Basically, if the oil stops flowing, our society starts coming apart at the seams. The folks who look at the problem of fossil fuel depletion and who see that our future is almost inevitably going to be characterized by less energy see a pretty dire situation. A lot of folks assume that, if fossil fuels do get more scarce and expensive, we'll just ramp up alternative energy sources and it'll all be the same. It'll all look the same, except we'll be driving electric cars. But, you start crunching the numbers. You look at where the alternative energy sources are right now. They're providing a trivial amount of energy. It's going to take decades and immense amounts of investment capital to ramp up the energy production from, solar and wind and geothermal and all these alternative energy sources. And most of them are not going to help very much with transportation. We're not going to have electric 747s ferrying people around from continent to continent. It's just never going to happen. It's technologically unfeasible. So you look at that, and the implications are pretty dire. I mean, can modern democracies operate in a situation of no economic growth? Because that's what we're really looking at. Historically, there's been a very close correlation between increased energy consumption and economic growth. So if the amount of energy we can use is declining, we may be seeing the end of economic growth as we've defined it basically right now. And we already see the kinds of political problems that are being created, not just in the United States, but in European countries like Greece, as a result of the financial crisis that happened in 2008. Well, that financial crisis has put a crimp on global economic growth. What if peak oil delivers the coup de grace? What if basically, if the economy starts to recover, then that increases demand for oil, and the oil just isn't there, so the way the market responds is much higher oil prices, and those higher oil prices kill demand and kill economic growth. And so we just have this ceiling now on what the economy can do. What happens to our political system without economic growth? What politician is going to be able to stand up in front of the American people and tell them the truth? Every politician is going to want to promise more economic growth and blame the lack of growth on the other political parties. So we throw these people out and put in the other political party, and they don't do any better, and we throw them out. I mean, the whole political system starts to get more and more polarized and more radical until it just comes apart at the seams. There's no solution until we actually are able to accept, as a people, accept the situation that we're in, where we actually have to change our way of life. When we're talking about fossil fuels, we're basically talking about minerals. And with all minerals, all non-renewable extractable resources, there's kind of a pyramid, a resource pyramid, the geologists call it. And the top of the pyramid, the capstone, is what you can get easily and cheaply. And all of the levels further down then are kinds of resource that are more generally distributed throughout the Earth's crust, not as concentrated. So it's lower quality ores or what have you. So with regard to oil, this capstone oil is the oil that's in the giant reservoirs that we were finding back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, we were finding pools of oil that are still producing 1 million, 2, 3 million barrels a day, even today, but they're depleting. Those are old, tired oil fields, and we have new technologies to kind of increase the lifespan of those supergiant old oil fields. But generally what we're doing is replacing those with much smaller oil fields that are either in rocks that are less porous, so it's harder to get the oil out of the ground, or they're in very inconvenient places like, a couple of miles of ocean water. So I mentioned the resource pyramid just a moment ago. The top part of the resource pyramid is what geologists call reserves. That's resources that have been identified through exploration, and we know that we can extract those resources using current technology at current market prices. Now, the rest of the pyramid we would just call resources, that we know that that stuff is out there in the Earth's crust, but the vast majority of it is never going to be extracted because either we don't have the technology and it's not likely to appear anytime soon, or the price would have to be so high. With oil, for example, if the price of oil were $500 a barrel, we could justify going after oil in really, really difficult places. But the problem is if oil cost $500 a barrel, we wouldn't have any economy to do that with. Plus, oil is a particular kind of resource. It's an energy resource, which means that if we expend so much energy in getting the stuff out of the ground, in exploring for it and drilling for it and capturing it and bringing it to the surface, if we expend so much energy doing that, that we've spent more energy in oil production than we get from the oil that we get out of the ground as we burn it and use it for all our economic purposes, then it's a pointless exercise. We might still find that oil valuable for making plastics or pharmaceuticals or something, but it has ceased to be an energy source. And so that's a hard limit on the amount of this stuff, of these resources that we can ultimately convert into reserves. People are always talking about various new finds of oil as though, this is going to save the day, peak oil. Yeah, look at all the oil they're finding off the coast of Brazil. Well, yes, it's true. Petrobras, the Brazilian state oil company, has been having very good luck finding oil in deep offshore waters in the sedimentary basins off the coast of Brazil. Problem here is that we're talking about ultra deep water oil. Now, we had a problem not too long ago in the Gulf of Mexico with the explosion of an oil rig called Deepwater Horizon. And the problem there was we were using some pretty advanced technology in some pretty inhospitable environments. We were drilling a mile deep in ocean water, and there was a problem, the explosion, huge oil leak, the worst environmental disaster in American history. Okay, what's happening in Brazil? We're talking about not a mile of ocean water, but 2 or 3 miles of ocean water. This is going to put oil drilling technology to the ultimate test. We're talking about having to invent new technologies to operate in environments that nobody has ever operated in before. So what if something goes wrong? It was hard enough to deal with the catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico. If something goes wrong in Brazil, it's going to be even worse. Plus, it's going to be that much more expensive to even do this. The Brazilians are, moving ahead kind of slowly because they're seeing how much investment it's going to take to actually exploit these new discoveries. The problem is not actually running out of oil because there's still lots of oil in the ground in various forms. The problem is we've gone after oil, as with all other natural resources on planet Earth, on the basis of the low-hanging fruit principle of resource extraction. We go after the cheapest, easiest to get, highest quality resources first, which means we're leaving the nastiest, dirtiest, most expensive, hardest to get at stuff for later. And guess what? It's later. All experts in the oil industry agree that we've reached the end of cheap oil. Back in the year 2000, if you'd said that in the year 2010 oil was going to cost $75 a barrel or maybe even $80 a barrel, you would have been laughed at. The pessimists back in 2000 said that oil in 2010 would cost $40 a barrel. The official projection was more like $20 a barrel. And The Economist magazine even had a cover story saying that oil would be $5 a barrel by 2010. So here we are with very expensive oil, and everyone has just adjusted slowly enough to think that this is somehow normal. This is just the natural state of affairs. But in fact, it's helping to cripple our economy. Every time the oil price spikes to a new level, it causes the economy to go into recession. This has been a consistent pattern over the last 35 years. So what happened in 2008, we saw an oil price spike up to about $147 a barrel, and immediately the airline industry nosedived, the automobile industry crashed and burned. All of the delivery services started laying off employees and idling their fleets. Well, the price of oil came back down to only $70 a barrel, which is what we have now. But most people don't understand. Historically, this is a very high price, and it reflects the fact that these days, in order to get oil, we have to drill in a mile or two of ocean water. We have to go to countries that are politically unstable. We have to, think about using things like tar sands that aren't even liquid oil. It's stuff that has to be mined from the ground and heated, using lots of energy. So all of this is going to be expensive and more expensive as time goes on. And the amount that we're going to be able to get is slowly going to diminish. There's increasing discussion in some quarters, at least, about the problem of oil depletion, and it usually goes by the moniker of peak oil. But in fact, the same principle holds true with all non-renewable resources and some renewable resources as well, like fish in the oceans and so on. So we really are facing a peak everything crisis. Sometimes people point to resources like coal, for example, as being super abundant. We have 200 years worth of coal. Actually, if you start looking at the situation very carefully, you see that what's being referred to is the whole resource pyramid. If we could extract all of the coal there is, say, in North America, we would have 200 years worth. But the reality is we're not going to extract all of that coal. Much of it is very low quality, in very thin seams that are uneconomic to mine. The reality is that we're likely to see peak coal production here in the United States within the next 20 years. Other minerals, iron ore, very abundant in the Earth's crust, but we're having to go after lower and lower quality ores all the time. And the way we do that is to expend more energy in mining. Well, that's fine if we have an infinite amount of energy, but we have this energy crisis. We've just been talking about peak oil and peak coal. Now, if we don't have the cheap energy to get the iron ore out with, we may have peak iron as well. And then we get to the more exotic materials like rare earth elements that we use for making powerful electromagnets, such as we use in wind turbines. And it turns out that rare earth elements are mostly being mined right now in China. And because China has the corner on the market of rare earths, and they're so important to these modern technologies, China is saying, well, we're going to cut back on exports. We're going to use all those rare earth elements ourselves to develop our own economy and screw the US and Europe. We could go on. Indium, tantalum, elements that are necessary to making cell phones and LCD screens. All of these things are depleting non-renewable resources that are becoming more scarce, that are going to become more expensive. So, really, essentially the problem is we've got too many people using too much stuff too fast in an economy that only knows how to grow. We're also facing problems with future supplies of uranium. A lot of people say, well, the solution to the energy crisis is going to be nuclear power? Well, first of all, nuclear power makes electricity. It doesn't make liquid fuels for cars and trucks and planes. But also, nuclear power depends upon another depleting non-renewable resource, i.e. uranium, which is becoming more scarce, and we're going to have supply problems by mid-century. So if we start building lots of new nuclear reactors now, that will even shorten the lifespan of the existing uranium reserves. Then there's phosphate rock that gives us phosphorus for conventional industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture is very, very dependent on phosphorus. And without those inputs of phosphate rock, industrial agriculture just, grinds to a halt after the course of a few years as the soil depletes in that element. Again, we're probably past peak phosphorus. Natural gas is looking better than it did a few years ago because we have this new technology called fracking, where we can find natural gas in very tight reservoirs where the rocks are not very porous at all. And ordinarily the natural gas just wouldn't flow. You drill a borehole and the natural gas would basically just stay where it is in the rock. Even though it's there, it wouldn't flow into the well. But with this new technology, by injecting chemicals, and mostly water, but some interesting chemicals, it opens up the pores of the rock, and then also horizontal drilling, and then setting off explosive charges along the drill path to open up the rock. All of these things are making this unconventional gas more accessible. And the industry is playing this up huge. It's saying, well, this is a game changer. Suddenly we have 100 years worth of natural gas. Well, wait a minute. This new technology is still very, very young. And what we're actually seeing is it's much more expensive to use this technology than the conventional natural gas drilling technology. So that means natural gas prices have to be much higher for these companies to make a profit. Right now, they aren't actually making a profit. What they're doing is they're trumpeting the amazing potential of this technology in order to gain investment capital from investors, and they're subsisting on investment capital rather than profits. Natural gas prices are going to have to double before these companies are actually producing a profit, and when natural gas prices get up to that level, then industrial users start to drop off the table. Natural gas gets too expensive. Of course, we use most of our oil for transportation, but a very significant portion of the oil that we use is for the food system. And in total, we use about 7 calories of fossil fuel energy for every calorie of food we produce. Now, this is an extraordinary situation because historically, agriculture was all about producing energy for human society. I mean, this is the most basic energy source we have, the food we eat. So to have a situation where it's costing us energy to produce food, it could never have happened prior to fossil fuels. So we use oil especially for transporting inputs to the farm and outputs from the farm to ultimately to our plate. We use fossil fuels for making nitrogen fertilizer. We use oil for running tractors and combines and seeders and all the other farm machinery, motorized farm machinery, for crop drying, for animal operations, and so on. Now, as oil becomes more expensive, what happens is that puts more pressure on farmers. And sooner or later, those higher costs get passed along to consumers in the form of higher food prices. But in the meantime, what you get are farmers going bankrupt because the food prices really aren't high enough for them to be able to stay in business and still pay for those fossil fuel inputs. So we have a food system that is addicted to oil. And as oil becomes more scarce and more expensive, that food system is going to be threatened in some pretty serious ways. Yeah, well, the notion that we're facing an agricultural crisis and a food crisis is becoming much more widespread now. Many experts on food systems are raising the alarm. You know, I think many folks tended to assume that genetically engineered food crops would sort of come to the rescue. The artillery, the cavalry would come to the rescue at the last minute, and we would have all these crop varieties that can grow in salty soil and be much more productive per acre and so on. But it hasn't really worked out that way. Most of the genetically altered food crops really are just designed to protect the crop from a certain patented kind of herbicide or something like that. So they've been, you know, very useful to the companies that have marketed them, but they haven't really expanded our food supply or made our food supply any more resilient. Just the opposite. The genetically altered seeds have to be produced centrally and then distributed via our transport system, which is all fossil fueled. So actually our food system is even less resilient, even more brittle than it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And so as fossil fuels dwindle, as they become more expensive, we could see a real food crisis, not, you know, by mid-century or the end of the century, but even just within the next 10 or 20 years. Well, since it's going to be very difficult for political leaders to get out in front of the peak oil problem and you know, convince the American electorate to embrace a lifestyle of reduced energy consumption, that's going to be a hard sell. I think the best path forward is going to have to be on the basis of grassroots organizing, people taking this information in and changing their own lives and then getting together with their neighbors to, you know, compare notes and help each other out. And this is happening. We've seen since the economic crisis of 2008, the sales of cars go down to the lowest level in 30 years, and the sales of bicycles soar. More people are planting home gardens. We're seeing the emergence of movements like the Transition Town initiatives that are popping up all over the world. They started in Britain. There's something like 200 or 300 transition towns in Britain now, and there are, you know, 80 or so here in the U.S. And this is, again, it's grassroots. It's not waiting for elected officials, either national or local, to get out and lead. It's saying, what can we do as citizens? And maybe, you know, it would be a lot easier if the elected policymakers were out there, you know, changing our tax structure to make it easier to put in renewable energy technologies and so on. It might be easier if that were the case, but it's not the case. So we have to do what we can. And actually, where these transition initiatives are taking root, it's pretty exciting to see, because it doesn't look so much like a protest march. It looks more like a party. Everyone is having a good time and finding a way to live that's actually more fulfilling. It's more communitarian. People are getting to know each other and work together. And you know, I think most of us actually miss that in our lives. We've become so individualistic and so concentrated on just, you know, paying the bills and getting ahead, being competitive, that a little bit of that communitarian spirit, you know, makes life a lot more interesting. Is there a cover-up of peak oil and all these other things, peak everything? Well, I think there is, to a certain extent. I think in the U.S. Department of Energy and the International Energy Agency, there are people who understand the situation and would like to sound the alarm, and they are being muzzled. I'm convinced that's the case. However, in a broader sense, I think that's more or less inevitable, because we have a political system and an economic system that are so entwined with economic growth that if anyone comes out and tells the public, you know, well, economic growth may not be possible anymore, and we're just all going to have to get used to living with less. You know, what does that do? It makes the stock market crash. It makes investments go sour. The whole economic system starts to come apart. Nobody wants to be responsible for that, especially after what happened in September 2008. So everybody just wants to put a nice smiley face on things and assure all and sundry that, we'll have plenty of energy in the future. Either there's lots of oil out there in, the Canadian tar sands or someplace, or if there isn't enough oil, we'll be able to get all the energy we need from, nuclear and solar panels and wind turbines. And we shouldn't worry. Whatever you do, don't worry about economic growth or energy. But it's a lie. We should be very worried, because this is the whole basis of our modern way of life, and that basis is being gradually taken out from under us.
Please come back and watch complete interviews with each of the experts. And you can join me, Tom Hartman, anytime on the web at tomhartman.com.